Or rather, okay, perfect. Okay, just give me 1 second to pull up my slides. Okay, fantastic. So thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to be talking about self-improvement in debating and judging, and in relation to coaching as well, because lots of the tips I'm going to talk to you about are actually really useful for how you coach and how you give feedback to others. So whether or not you're just judging a spar and you're trying to give feedback to whoever is in that spar, or whether or not you're trying to go for a more detailed coaching regimen, I think this would also be useful for you. But of course, it's primarily catered towards self-improvement in debating and judging in particular. And any of the lessons you learn will hopefully be cross-applicable in coaching as well. So there are going to be 7 things that we cover today then. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the purpose of this activity and of this workshop, and also the approach that one should take when thinking about it. Then I'll talk about general principles of self-improvement in debating. Then I'll go over some judge-specific things like giving good feedback and improving as a judge. And then I'll discuss I'm going to discuss 7 different areas in which individuals can improve. So you can see all the different issues there, but it's broadly speaking about debate philosophy, note-taking, strategy, content framing, emphasis, and team prep and synergy. Lastly, we're going to end off by talking a little bit about how you use your strengths properly and then how you compensate for weaknesses. Okay, lovely. So let's just jump right into it then. To begin with, what are we going to be doing today? First of all, we're going to talk about how we diagnose strengths and weaknesses in debate. And that is honestly one of the most important parts of the process. Because if you aren't able to understand whether or not you are doing something well or poorly, it's incredibly difficult to continue to improve. In addition, we're going to learn about how we can properly provide feedback to others. That's related to being able to diagnose strengths and weaknesses, because the better judges are at diagnosing those issues and discussing them in feedback, the easier it will be for speakers to be able to understand what they need to work on. Then, on top of that, we're going to think about a regimented routine in order to improve the weaknesses or whatever it is someone wants to improve in their debating. And with whatever remaining weaknesses are left, we're going to consider how we work around them and how we're able to still succeed despite some gaps in our debating. Now, all the things I'm going to talk about come from my own personal experience coaching, and it's in a variety of different ways. I've done paid coaching, volunteer coaching, coaching in WSDC, BP, and a number of different formats. However, I also acknowledge that not everyone learns the same. So everything that I'm going to discuss today are merely going to be seen as rules of thumb. And in my experience, the guidance that I'm giving is typically correct in terms of whether or not a certain piece of feedback means that you have a certain debate weakness. But obviously, I'm not going to claim that this is correct for every single person. People learn differently. People have different ways of expressing debate weaknesses in terms of how they debate. And that means that there's always going to be some degree of discretion and indeterminacy here. Okay, great. Let's chat about general principles about improvement. And these are honestly probably the most important things overall. If you don't remember anything else from this workshop, these general principles are going to be great guides on how an individual can improve themselves, but also in terms of understanding how you can help others improve. So 5 key points here. The first point is that all debate feedback and all self-improvement should be around patterns and trends. Rounds, you might make a mistake on the content. You might not know what's happening. So for instance, you might have a finance round and you don't understand the complex financial terms or the complex financial issues. And when you think about your own speech and when you're giving feedback to another speech, it's important to think about not just the content, but how you systematize that feedback and bring it to a bigger picture or to a broader issue. So for instance, in that finance round, if the problem was that you weren't able to properly give economic arguments, it isn't useful to just say, this is what the proper econ on this motion is. It does help, but it will only ever help if they experience and debate the same motion or something very, very similar. Rather, you should give them rules of thumb about how to think about this issue. So for instance, you might think, well, okay, true. Maybe if we, for instance, ban payday loans, that's not particularly financial, but let's take that as an example. Maybe you have a discussion about payday loans, and someone says on the proposition for banning payday loans that we ought to ban payday loans because there's a huge risk of a large number of people defaulting, and that could cause a financial crash. On opposition, you can question this argument and beat it without even realizing the finance behind it, because there are overarching things that we can observe. For instance, this argument is very unintuitive. It exists in the status quo. So you can tell a speaker, well, yes, obviously the content here doesn't make sense. It's not like people failing to pay off their payday loans will lead to this massive collapse of the financial system. But you can also tell from basic intuition that the proposition is overclaiming here. Obviously, not that many people take out payday loans. We can see in the status quo it doesn't have that harm. Just try and think about common sense and framing the argument under common sense. That would be an example of taking a specific piece of feedback and then trying to make it more broad and generalizable, which is really useful for finding patterns and then being able to identify what to do to fix those patterns, okay? So big picture, connect it back to patterns and trends, try and find overarching issues within someone's debating and connect it back to those. Second thing, in practice, depending on what sorts of skills you're practicing, you need to have an accurate assessment of the speaker, and if it's yourself, your own comfort with motions, exercises, and positions. The basic reasoning is as follows. If you're trying to encourage your students or yourself to practice new skills, it's really difficult to do so when there's 100 other things to juggle in a debate round. For instance, if someone really needs to work on their framing, while that is a really, really important goal, if they're in a difficult debate round where they obviously just find the motion difficult, they're not going to be able to practice framing because they don't even know what is necessary in order for them to properly debate the motion. They might not know the content of the round. They might not even understand what's happening. If they're on back half, it might force them specifically to think about new content rather than framing. So giving them an easy kind of scenario in order for them to practice those skills will allow them to really focus and own in onto those things. The third thing is just engaging with students. And if you're thinking about this personally, it would also mean engaging with what the judge says. And what this basically means is that you want to talk about the thought process of how someone decides what they're going to rebut or why they're running the case that they are with a judge or with your students, whoever it is in that respective position of yours, whether or not you're a coach or a debater or whatever you're doing. And the reason why this matters is because it's important not just to tell someone what you would do, but to explain the thought process. Explaining the thought process is what allows them to generalize that and replicate it, because when they encounter a different motion, they're going to think through all of the issues that you've discussed. Like, for instance, whether or not I should narrow the debate, whether or not it's strategic to counter model or counter prop in this circumstance. And similarly, if you are a person who's getting feedback, you should also talk to the judge about what they're thinking too, in order to be able to capture their thoughts and be able to understand it in full depth. The fourth thing that's important is, and this is really crucial, simplifying and systematizing key observations. So lots of the things that I coach on are just things that I've thought a lot about, and then I just turn them into rules or I turn them into a list. A lot of the time we have a lot of debate knowledge floating up in our brains, and we just need to figure out a way to distill it and communicate it clearly. So what I do is I try and sit down and think about the various types of motions that I have encountered or the various types of mistakes that people are making in debate rounds. And based on those observations, I will start creating a list of rules or systematize those observations by saying, for instance, in these sorts of motions, these are the 3 key things that you need to do in every single round. So just by simplifying and systematizing it, you can make it easy to access for your audience. The final thing that I want to talk about is just acknowledging that there's a variety of viewpoints and alternative perspectives in debate rounds. And this is a huge, huge issue because lots of speakers are inflexible and only view debate in the lens that they view it under. They can't see how a judge with different metrics or a judge with different judging preferences would call it a different way. But frankly speaking, there is no uniform approach to debate judging and no uniform approach to debating in general. So a useful thing to do is always think about what the judge was thinking when they were making a decision. And that's crucial when you think you've won a round, but then you end up taking the loss, taking the fourth or something like that. Because acknowledging how the judge may come from a different background in terms of their debate philosophy will allow you to fully understand the problems in your debating and what you need to improve upon. Great, so those are on general principles. Just as a quick note, if people have questions, Please feel free to ask throughout. You can even just message in the chat. I'm happy to. If not, I can take questions at the very end as well. Okay, next we're going to talk about giving good feedback. And this is going to be useful for coaching. This is going to be useful for judging. And if you're thinking about giving feedback to yourself, like reflecting upon rounds, this is also useful. So there are two different things I think are incredibly valuable in good feedback and also broadly in OAs as well. First of all, good feedback is specific. And second of all, good feedback has a broader suggestion on how to fix problems. What do I mean by these two things? Well, let's think about specificity. And I have an example here to help you understand what we're talking about. The motion is this how supports the creation and use of lethal autonomous robots. So let's say that the proposition argues that through creating and using lethal autonomous robots, there will be more humanitarian interventions. What's important is if you're a judge and you're giving feedback, you don't just say, I don't buy this argument. And in fact, you have to make sure that you're flagging the argument properly in the first place. Some judges don't even properly flag the particular argument that they're evaluating or that they're comparing. But once you want to make sure that you're quite specific about it and note the problems. You don't just say you didn't buy it. Instead, note an issue. Like for instance, this argument is somewhat symmetric because in many circumstances, for every single life you save in a humanitarian intervention, you also kill someone unjustly in a war like Iraq. And when we have lethal autonomous robots, it also makes the rocks easier too. You might be able to lose out on the argument due to weighing because even if it's bought, it might be the case that the judge thinks arguments around, say, for instance, war crimes are more important than the entry of war. Or perhaps the judge notes that you have a premise that is incorrect or that potentially opens you up for some kinds of opportunities from the opposition. So for instance, the premise here being that there will be more interventions when you have lethal autonomous robots. If you're a judge, you want to specifically note what your problem with the argument is. Speakers, I think, get somewhat annoyed when you aren't specific about the problem. If you just say, for instance, I didn't buy it. And it also means that you're more able to help them understand what the problems in their debating are. Because if you can note the particular problem and they regularly get that problem, like their arguments aren't weighed properly, the claim is symmetric, it helps them to form those patterns and understand what exactly is happening. On a secondary level then, after you've identified what is the specific argument and what the problem is, you want to make sure that you are extrapolating these lessons and relating it to something as a broad debate skill. So for instance, the problem here is that the speaker might be bad at weighing, or they might be bad at anticipating the responses that come from the other side. And if they're regularly getting that feedback, then that enables them to understand what they need to do. Now, in these circumstances, you also want to give advice. If they're not preempting properly, you might want to tell them that they need to spend some time in the prep room thinking about the other side's case or thinking about the debate in clashes rather than individual arguments on proposition or opposition. But you always want to identify that overarching skill, and then afterwards, you want to give feedback that notes what exactly they can do to improve upon it. And if you're an individual who's trying to improve yourself, this is the exact same process. Go through your arguments, assess them, evaluate them. What was the problem in your arguments? Be critical because that's the only way you can improve, and then connect it back to broader skills and think about ways to fix those problems. Okay. Lastly, before we get into the specific areas of improvement, I want to talk about improving as a judge. And so feedback is obviously part of that, but here are 3 things if you're just thinking about judging by itself and giving OAs. So the first thing is specificity. I've already noted this, but you want to be specific, not just in the problems of an argument and what they are, but also in terms of recounting clashes, who said what was the rebuttal, what was the reconstruction, and then attributing your arguments properly. So say opening government might have said this to a certain extent, they gave this line of analysis, but closing government added on with this analysis. So make sure that you're extremely specific, you attribute arguments correctly, and that you recount clashes where you take into account really important responses and you can show how that clash evolved over the debate. The second key thing in judging is prioritization, and particularly, what are you going to talk about in your oral adjudication? What are you going to focus in on in your deliberation as a panel? And so you need to prioritize the key points of clash to summarize, and you want to make sure that you summarize and explain how they weigh up. So identifying what was the most decisive material and whether or not a team wins or loses will assist you in this. Because if you know what the big issues are, it means that you're much less likely to skip over something that the team thinks is important and needed to be credited. And that ensures that they feel heard. It also ensures that you're doing a better job of judging because you're actually thinking about what matters in your decisions. The final thing that's really important in judging is consistency in evaluation frameworks. What do I mean by that? Well, in debating, we have a lot of different rules. Like for instance, we don't credit an argument that is derivative, or at least we don't credit it very much. Or for instance, if an argument is absurd, as it's stated in the Thailand Judge Guide, then we can discount and discredit that argument. Or for instance, our approach to knifing, what do we do if a team knifes? And the important thing is that when we take a position, like we say, if this argument has this number of mechanisms, or in these circumstances, this argument is derivative, we apply that standard to all teams equally. The thing that frustrates teams the most, I think, is when they end up having their arguments called derivative, but it seems like that standard is unevenly applied and another closing team gets away with it. Or their arguments are discounted and completely basically ignored because they're not seen as plausible and they're seen as absurd. But another team's seemingly absurd argument isn't ignored. So you want to make sure that you're consistent in these evaluation frameworks. And part of what will help with this is your specificity. If you can be really clear about why it is you thought one argument was derivative and the other argument was not, then it makes it easier to be able to properly communicate that. Okay, in identifying these weaknesses, I guess it didn't transcribe properly, but the big thing to think about in identifying weaknesses is you want to think about getting feedback as a judge yourself. So that means you can take opportunities to judge spars. There are a number of different spar opportunities that are currently available in different spar groups that currently exist. And judging there and getting anonymous feedback will be useful. Also, feel free to regularly ask other chairs that you've judged with for feedback, or ask for general feedback at the end of a tournament from the AJ Corps if they're willing to provide it. Typically, you won't be able to get very specific feedback, but you should be able to get general overarching feedback on what most of the big points of issue were with your judging, or what most judges thought about your judging in terms of weaknesses, strengths, whatever it is. Okay, great. Next, let's think a little bit about areas of improvement. This is a blank slide mostly because we're going to jump right into the first one. So on debate philosophy, a really important part of debating is understanding that people have different perspectives about debate. And I'm going to just talk about two of the biggest schisms or perspectives in debate that seem to divide debaters and judges. And I hope by enumerating it, it makes it clear to everyone what the big points of disagreement are. But I also think it is useful in terms of helping people understand how they can adjust their debating and how they can end up improving it by considering different philosophies. So the first schism is about the standard of intervention. In the WUDC Judge Manual, you're allowed to discredit an argument or not factor it in if you think it is absurd. That is the phrasing that is used in the Thailand Judge Guide. And lots of judges take this approach of saying you just need to use common sense. If it is crazy from a common sense perspective, then the argument should not be credited. Other people have different viewpoints. They think that we should credit everything that is said and reasonably proven, even if we think the premises are somewhat doubtful. And oftentimes the two camps actually have some similarities. At some point, I think people who look at the flow primarily and just look at what's said in the debate will still think an argument might be crazy if it's blatantly offensive. Like say, for instance, an argument defending a Holocaust denial or something terrible like that, right? I think most people would be like, that is nonsense. That's a crazy premise. We're not going to entertain it. So really the difference is oftentimes where you draw the line. Now, why does that matter in terms of one's debating and in terms of one's judging? Well, in terms of judging, it just helps you to consider the different perspectives that come about and help you to understand different ways of judging and viewing a debate. But in terms of speaking, this is really important because it affects what you focus on. If the judge is all about individual lines of analysis and proving things, and they don't really care about common sense, they just care about analytical strength, this changes what you need to prioritize. You're going to need to spend a lot more time directly rebutting arguments rather than doing framing and generally framing arguments out. Whereas if someone is more about common sense, that means that you would not need to spend as much time on an argument that is unintuitive or seems strange. And that's also another really important thing. Judges who intervene often, and when I say intervene, I don't mean it in a negative sense. I mean that they regularly think that arguments need to use common sense and it seems implausible, which is a fair position. In that case, it helps you to also understand how much time you need to spend responding to something or defending an argument. And that will be largely based on how intuitive that argument is. Now, the second schism in debating is oftentimes on the level of realism. Is this argument true? Are the facts in favor of the argument? And if your judge really believes in debates that have factual premises behind them, then you want to choose the most realistic arguments possible. Whereas if the judge is more permissive of arguments that are logically constructed but might not have any grounding in reality, it might mean that instead you choose to run arguments that might be slightly more implausible but can be logically proven. And this is also going to end up having an additional effect on your debating, because if you think about different ways of approaching debate, it will help you in terms of case and argument construction. Some people like to think about the facts of the world, try and characterize and illustrate what it looks like, and then deduce arguments from those facts. And that is actually a useful way to prep for many people. Other people try and use their logic first. They think, what is logically true and what do I want to prove? And then they just try and get there. That's also really useful. And I think in different contexts, it will be useful in different ways. So you want to have both skills because you might get motions which are more suited for one or the other. Like for instance, if you have a really broad, vague narrative debate, you want to make sure that you ground it in the real world and explain what the narrative looks like. So starting from a characterization and the facts of the real world will oftentimes help you to sell a plausible image of how people behave. How can you tell if you have a weakness in debate philosophy? Well, if good judges are regularly telling you that they don't buy your arguments, the problem is likely that you currently are running unintuitive arguments. And that's because your philosophy is one where you don't have any degree of intervention and you don't allow judges to discredit arguments based on plausibility and common sense. Second of all, if judges think that your arguments are on the right track but don't think it's been proven, then the problem is that you're too intuitionistic. You're not rigorous enough in mechanizing the arguments in detailed ways. So those are ways to tell that those are the problems that you have. And really the way to fix this is just think about it. You don't need to do any drills or activities. It's just about thinking about arguments and how you evaluate them. The next thing to talk about is note-taking, clarity, and execution. And I want to focus on this because I think lots of people ignore this, both in their own debating and in other people's debating. But note-taking is essential for ensuring that you have clear speeches and really, really clean speeches. So how can you tell note-taking is a problem? Here are a couple of signs that there are note-taking problems. So if a speaker regularly adds extra filler onto the end of sentences, so they provide a sentence, it's short, brief, concise, it seems to summarize the point well, and then they seem slightly unsure about themselves and they're like, okay, wait, I need to re-explain it. So they keep on going even though they've explained it in sufficient depth. That probably means that they haven't written their notes in a way that allows for them to have a cutoff, where it's clear, once I say this and end with this, the argument has been properly explained. Furthermore, more broadly speaking, if the speaker just generally seems unsure in what they're saying, or they have unclear explanations for their arguments, their rebuttal, this also tends to be a note-taking problem. And this is just because if you had really, really good notes, you would have had precise writing for all of those things. What are some tips on how you can improve this? Well, 3 things. First of all, whenever you have tricky arguments or tricky lines of rebuttal, you want to write in a lot more detail. And you're probably going to want to add illustrations or other small characterizational issues or lines of analysis as well, because that is oftentimes added to the response and people don't think about it until they get onto the floor. Second of all, when arguments are easier to make, you won't want to write it out in as much depth. You might want to just shorthand it and have one sentence or a couple of words to summarize it. But even in that case, you want to think about how you want to say those arguments, at least mentally, so that you have a general sense of how you're going to execute. And then the final thing in terms of note-taking, just employ clear labels, so titles for arguments, and have point-first responses. What do I mean by a point-first response? Well, point-first response is very similar to point-first writing in legal writing. Basically, you begin with the conclusion of a response rather than getting into some weird kind of discussion about it and trying to mechanize it before the judge even knows what you're talking about. So let me give you an example here. Let's say there's a debate about deterrence, and one side is making the classic argument, if we impose harsher penalties, we're going to have greater deterrence. In rebutting it, there are 2 ways to do so. The first way of doing so is just getting into the rebuttal right away. Well, actually, I don't think that's true because in many circumstances, people end up being motivated by other factors, not rationality. Like some people might end up having strong incentives to commit crimes because it's a crime of passion, so they aren't thinking clearly. Or it might be the case they don't think they're getting caught, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, because I cut to the chase quickly, it's not that big of a problem. But for some people who are really long-winded, they add in a lot of fluff, which makes it difficult to see the point. The second way of doing so is with the point versus response. Much like an argument, you begin with a title to your response. It's untrue that many people are motivated by deterrence, and thus the proposition argument is proposition does not reduce crime. And then you would go into saying there are three different actors for which this is relevant. First, for crimes of passion, those who commit crimes of passion are unlikely to factor in this deterrence because they aren't thinking rationally at the moment. And the difference is the judge knows what you're trying to prove in that response because he flagged at the very top what your response is. It's just not true that people are incentivized in this matter. What activities and drills can we use to practice these things? Well, drills specifically designed to give debaters time to write things out in detail. So giving them a strong amount of time, like say 10 minutes to write out one argument, will ensure that they have enough time to practice their note-taking in depth. And then gradually you want to start reducing time to increase time pressure. And that helps them to prioritize what to write, helps them to think of ways in order to develop shorthands, and then helps them to think generally more sharply because it means that they are gradually becoming better and better at speaking off the cuff with very little time. So that is on note-taking, clarity, and execution. Next, strategy, preemption, and round vision. What do I mean by strategy? Well, strategy is broadly just about picking the right arguments and stances. So in order to accomplish this, we need two different skills. First of all, we want to have preemption. Preemption is crucial, and all I'm referring to is being able to understand what other teams are going to argue. What will the other side argue? What will your back half argue? If you're on back half, what will your front half argue? And in these cases, I like thinking about both a narrow and wide case. Because for instance, the other side could run a really, really wide case, like try and claim lots of impacts, or they could try and make it really, really tiny. So let's say the motion is this House would abolish the Olympics. Proposition makes a bunch of arguments about how the Olympics is very bad, and opposition stands up and they can take one of two approaches. They can either say, well, actually, we're fine with all of these things because we think, for instance, countries being able to host the games is actually economically beneficial, not economically harmful as the proposition says. So they just concede, yeah, we aren't going to reform the system. Everything's going to be the status quo, and we're willing to take up the big impacts on both sides. Sometimes you get corrupt governments on proposition building stadiums that are way too expensive, but sometimes you get benefits in opposition because the construction of those stadiums do genuinely bring economic benefit to that society. Alternatively, opposition can narrow the debate. They can say, well, actually, we're going to take away the Olympics from any country that has failed in auditing, that has used human labor, for instance, and we'd award it instead to another country that already has pre-existing infrastructure. Both are valid cases, but one is taking the big burden of saying, okay, yep, 100%, we're going to defend the IOC as it is, even though there are some corrupt instances, there are also good instances of the IOC, or you might try and mitigate the whole debate and minimize all impacts by narrowing with that counter problem. The next thing to talk about is round vision. So being able to understand how arguments relate to one another. For instance, understanding how exactly it is on back half, your additional analysis in an analysis extension adds on to what the front half is saying and what it strategically does, and whether or not there are contradictions or knives, whether or not your arguments fill in the front half arguments and make them complete and win them. So how do you know if you have strategy issues? Well, on front half, if you're regularly getting feedback or you're noting that you aren't properly predicting how the round develops late in the round, you don't anticipate the rebuttal to your arguments, it's a pretty clear indication that you aren't thinking deeply enough about what the other side is going to say and what exactly is going to happen as the round progresses. Similarly, on back half, if you fail to anticipate what the front half talks about, then that is probably also an issue of strategy and preemption. How do we improve these issues? Well, you should just find a high quality online round, WUDC out rounds, the round robin, try and anticipate what will be argued in the front half, and then give a PM speech with that in mind. Listen to the front half, see whether or not your PM matches the PM in the round, and also whether or not the rest of the top half panned out in the way that you thought it would. And then if possible, try and talk about that strategy and those strategic considerations to a friend or someone else. And then when judging or paying attention to debates, just think about how arguments interact with one another. How does, for instance, analysis on a similar issue add on or build onto an existing argument? Does it add on or build on, or does it become too derivative? All of those sorts of considerations. Next, on content, mechanization, and impacting. There are three things I think you want to think about when constructing arguments. First of all, you want to think about how intuitive is my argument. Before you even get into any analysis, is this argument something that people are willing to buy and something that seems true? Lots of debaters get away with not giving very much analysis on plenty of things because the argument just seems intuitive. Even say, for instance, the basis for prioritizing minority rights. Philosophically speaking, there's a utilitarian argument on diminishing marginal utility. There's also an argument of reparations. And yet in debate rounds, no one goes through the mech work to explain why it is the case that we should prioritize minorities. And that's because the argument is just so intuitive and so believable in debate land that we ought to just accept it on face. So that is important. If your argument's intuitive, it's going to be easier to make. Second of all, how well mechanized is the argument? Are you giving good enough reasons for why the argument is true? And then finally, what are the impacts of your argument? Now, I want to just focus specifically on making good arguments, not choosing the arguments, because good strategy is typically what helps you to select which arguments are most important. And the only other dimension of this is if you can mechanize something, then you can run the argument. If you can't mechanize something, then it's hard to run it. So yes, this will slightly affect how you select arguments, but it is more so about giving you the tools necessary to pick the best arguments in the debate with your strategic senses. How do you know then if your argumentation isn't strong enough? Well, two things. First of all, if you regularly find that you cannot articulate why the argument is true, or second of all, your arguments are often defeated not by weighing, but by direct rebuttal. The first problem is one which is deeply related to mechanization, because if you can't articulate why it's true, then it means that you can't mech out the argument. If it's the case that the argument gets defeated, not by weighing, but by direct rebuttal, that's also another indication that the mechanisms aren't very strong. But if it's the inverse, your arguments are getting defeated by weighing rather than by direct rebuttal, that probably means that you didn't impact your arguments very well. Obviously, there's also the third aspect about intuition and how intuitive my argument is, but I've already mentioned earlier that typically when you get comments that a judge just didn't buy something, that means that you aren't really picking intuitive arguments. How do you then improve upon the arguments that you've selected? Well, for mechanisms, I actually try and often find an end conclusion in a debate and find justifications. So let's go back to the example about abolishing the Olympic Games. Proposition has this argument about human rights abuses. And one of my favorite things to do is if I'm on opposition, I'm like, all right, Prop's big argument is on human rights abuses, human slavery used in the construction of the World Cup stadiums, displacement of homeless populations in Rio de Janeiro, etc. And so with that in mind, on opposition, I might think, okay, well, is there any way for me to prove that actually maintaining the Olympic Games reduces human rights violations? And oftentimes I'll just take a few seconds to think about whether or not I can mech that out. And so this is great practice for mechanisms because you start with a conclusion and then you find justifications and mechanisms along the way. And you just want to make sure that you're doing this often and then stress testing your mechanisms, trying to find regular problems or consistent problems that are showing up over time, particularly in searching motions or in particular types of mechanisms that you're running. For impacting practice, basically I try and do argument drills where I specifically focus on explaining why impacts are important comparatively speaking. So in weighing versus another argument. That's typically the biggest problem. People don't do enough work in detailing their impacts and really explaining them vis-a-vis or in relation to other arguments in the debate. So if you can think about what your impacts actually are and how they relate to other arguments, you're going to be much better off because you're implicitly engaging in some degree of weighing. Okay, next slide. Framing, characterization, and illustration. So framing is a lot broader than just characterization and illustration, but I think characterization and illustration are two particular skills that debaters need to work on to frame better. What do I mean by framing? Well, framing refers to anything that makes an argument more important than others. And I suspect that the term comes from politics, where framing is referred to in social movements as a way of how you get the public to be sympathetic towards your social movement. How do you display it, or how do you end up presenting it to the public so that they understand it in a favorable light? And characterization and illustration are both helpful ways of doing so. because by characterizing the real world, you can oftentimes say the arguments from the other side are logically true, but they make no sense in reality, and therefore you should credit us instead. So how do you tell if you have problems with framing or illustration? Well, if you're getting lots of comments that your case doesn't seem grounded or contextualized, that's too abstract, or you're losing lots of framing and characterization extensions when you're on front half, or you're just getting beaten by teams who narrow the debate through framing. So for instance, an example of counterpropping and abolish the Olympics. These are all indications that you aren't thinking enough about what the real world looks like, what kinds of measures can be taken to reform it, and what potential dangerous frames in general are available from the other side. So those are indications that framing and illustration and characterization are things that you want to work on. Now, how do you improve upon this? Always think about what the world is likely to look like think about what the debate is likely to look like in the real world, and then you want to sell it with illustrations or first principles. So devote time and prep to think about this. You might have specific preps where you specifically focus on this, and you might not be preparing for a round, but you're just doing a prep with your partner. Now, importantly, illustrations need to be grounded. They need to give me a picture as to what this looks like in the real world. So instead of just saying there's human slavery when talking about the Olympics, you might want to say there's human slavery where children are forced to work grueling hours and construct stadiums in Qatar in order to ensure that wealthy tourists who come in 3 years later are able to have a good time while those children are suffering under the auspices of justice. Something like that, some kind of very specific picture in which you can make it clear what the human costs are like. If you want to find a really, really great video that shows this, the WUDC 2014 Grand Finals is a great example where the Prime Minister basically debates in a bunch of economic jargon, and then the Deputy Prime Minister does a lot of illustrating and characterization. Other ways to improve on framing and characterization issues, read more about the world. That will typically help you just think about what the real world looks like. And then finally, specifically on framing, think more about hardline versus narrow cases. So again, the example I gave in the strategy section where I talked about how you can accept the full burden of the debate, or you might counterprop to narrow the debate. And so the debate is no longer whether or not we think countries are able or competent enough to run the Olympics, but whether or not we have regulations that are sufficient to be able to deal with the incompetencies of countries who do run the Olympics. Okay, great. So that is on framing, characterization, and illustration. Next, on emphasis, persuasion, and manner. All I'm going to say here at the top is even though we deride it, style ends up being factored into judging, even if it's not explicit. But there are some easy ways to help make sure that your style can be as good as it can be without having any significant amounts of investment in time. So there are two things in style that I think you should always be particularly cognizant of. First of all, if impacts are undercredited when weighing. One big area where style seems to matter is when you impact that argument and make it seem weighty, make it seem important. The second area that you can look at if you want to detect whether or not you have style issues is whether or not your material, and importantly, your really crucial material, is being ignored. Because that means that you're not indicating to the judge what is important in your speech and what isn't using your style. Now, there are some drills, obviously, to try and improve upon these things. First of all, you want to practice giving PMs where you specifically designate a specific area to stylistically emphasize. So for instance, if you have an argument which ends up with the conclusion of we saved millions of lives, you might on your flow write, okay, I'm going to emphasize this part. I'm going to add illustrations. I'm going to add rhetoric. I'm going to change my tone and pace. I'm going to make it really clear to the judge that this is important so they can't ignore it. You might even say things like crucially or underline this to the judge. And in doing this, you want to find a shorthand where you can basically identify what you want to do with very few words or letters. Like, for instance, if you want to make that section particularly passionate or sad, you might have a very, very brief 3-letter acronym to explain what exactly you want from that section. Second thing, just think about a list of words that you find powerful and float easily off of the tongue. So this is useful in making your argument seem important, and it also helps to increase efficiency and impacting. Let's say we're describing the harm of jail time to someone, right? We could go through a long list and we could talk about how jail time deprives someone of their ability to make an income. It means that they're no longer able to be mobile in society. It means that they are abandoning their family and that they have no way to get those familial connections. Or you could just do it briefly in a stylistic way where you say, The deprivation of liberty that is imposed by jail time is of utmost importance, and that constitutions in the world protect it because it is an inviolable right. I think everyone here agrees that jail time is massively damaging to one's life. I think that's enough to explain why. Obviously here, you're not really doing that much. You're just kind of using fancy language, but lots of people buy into it. And if you listen to Xiao's 2016 grand final speech from Thus Worlds, a lot of the impacting and a lot of the power comes from using language in an efficient manner rather than taking as much time as other people do in illustrating everything along the way. So finding those powerful words and getting a list of it so that you can easily use it. Words like subjugation, oppression, analogies like daybreak to nighttime, all of those sorts of things, you're going to be better able to make your arguments seem more impactful when you deliver them. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of improvement is team synergy and the prep process. So in terms of identifying prep problems in particular, it's going to come from trial and error. Not every partnership has the same problems, and therefore you need to be individually evaluating this. But there are a couple of indications and signs that there's a problem, and hopefully you can get to the bottom of it after you discover these problems. So 3 particular signs. First of all, if the amount of content you're creating in prep is less than your usual partnerships, that seems to indicate that you and this partner aren't working well together because you typically are able to have more efficient prep times. If your explanation and defense and expansion of the case in the round is way better than your prep time, again, another indication that you're probably very good debaters, but you aren't maximizing your prep time to its fullest extent. And then the final consideration is if just generally your prep times are awkward or have fights or just generally acrimonious. If that's the case, then obviously there needs to be something done. Now, in terms of improving upon these things, there are 3 things I would recommend. First of all, you want to talk with your partner and try and prep in multiple different ways. For instance, you might allocate different roles to the partners. One partner focuses on illustrations, other partner focuses on analysis. This is kind of related to what I'm saying in the next comment, but also just generally whether or not you have more or less silent prep, all of those sorts of small considerations. I think I've basically mentioned the strengths and weaknesses thing and how you can basically work around that. You just assign each person to focus on their strengths. And then finally, it's useful to actually have external parties like other people listen to your prep and provide their own opinions. Oftentimes they can see things that we ourselves cannot see, and that is really, really useful in ensuring that we can have a good understanding of our prep, especially because when we're invested in it ourselves and we're doing it, we don't always have the clearest picture of what's going right and what's going wrong. Next, on leveraging strengths. So we've spent a great deal of time talking about strengths and weaknesses in debating and how we can identify those strengths and weaknesses, how exactly we can improve upon those weaknesses. Now, here we want to think about what we do once we've identified strengths, because obviously we've talked about how to improve upon weaknesses, but there are some things that are inherent strengths of ours. Well, the first thing is just make sure that you have good practice using your strengths and those skills in stronger rounds than you're used to, because the better the round, obviously, the less of a comparative advantage you have with your strengths. So if you just practice those things in good rounds, you're going to be able to win in good rounds with those skills. Like for instance, if you're really good at framing, you want to make sure that you can win high-level rounds just by framing, so that you have that option whenever you get into a really, really competitive room. The second thing is just specialize in between partners. And this isn't just in prep, but also in terms of speech time. If your partner's really great at rebuttal and you're a member speaker, don't rebut very much at all. Try and rebut as little as possible and prioritize getting the extension out there and weighing it and explaining how it interacts with other arguments. If you're really good at illustrating, then you want to spend more time illustrating and grounding the debate. Whereas if you're really good at analysis, you want to spend more time just giving out mechanisms. And obviously you want both speakers to be well-rounded, but to a certain extent, you can compensate for one another. Even in my own partnership with Chin at Worlds in 2020, I think the reason why we were effective is because I just kind of thought about Chin's strengths and weaknesses and Chin thought about mine, and we developed a team strategy that worked around it. I would push a ton of content in my first speeches because I'm a very efficient speaker, and then Chin, who's extremely stylistic and powerful, would just choose whatever he wanted to pick up and then make that really important and outweigh everything else. So that's what we did on front half, and it was specifically designed to help us with our strengths, to specialize on what we're good at and use that to win rounds. This also means that you should pick your partners with an awareness of strengths and weaknesses, because your best partner may not always be the best debater overall. Sometimes the best debater overall is good at the exact same things that you're good at, and it isn't actually useful to bring them onto the team. So in thinking about leveraging strengths, you also want to consider who your partners are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Finally, compensating for weaknesses. So really, I think on weaknesses, we want to have conservative approaches where we're not trying to aim for wins every single round, but instead we're trying to get good enough so that we start taking thirds instead of fourths, so that we start taking seconds instead of thirds. And with that in mind, I think it's pretty achievable to compensate for those weaknesses. So there are 3 different ways in which I think you can do so. First of all, you want to just acquire enough general information from motion types if that's your issue. Just research about the world. And I will recommend that you just find easy ways to research. Like if it's finance and econ, just look up Investopedia. If it's philosophy, look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There are lots of really, really easy and accessible resources that you can use. Even, for instance, on IR, Googling things. I would highly recommend actually just Googling your IR issues every week. Like pick a different country, Google it, look at Wikipedia, read something about it for like 30 minutes. You're going to know a lot more than you did before. It's not that much time, and it really does help quite a lot. Second of all, you want to learn when it's acceptable to aim for a second. The problem when you're on emotion or in a circumstance you're weak at is that you probably don't have an extension or you don't have enough matter. And in that case, you just need to be able to identify when you can just take a second by rebutting the other bench and taking them out. Because in some circumstances, taking the second is the best you can do, and learning when you have a weakness and when you should be aiming for the second is crucial. Finally, make sure that you cover all of your bases and never get panicked. What I mean by this is keeping composure, even in motions which are difficult and in high stakes scenarios. Lots of times, debaters just end up going back to the bad habits when they're in a position where they are incredibly nervous or where it's emotion that they're weak at. And the big thing that I want to encourage is to maintain your same mental game. One of the big things with weaknesses is that people enter into that debate thinking they're going to lose because the motion isn't right for them, or it's from the wrong position, or they're closing someone who burns a lot of material. And that means that you debate worse as a consequence. Instead, focus on giving a good speech in that moment. You can't control anything else, like the other teams, what positions they are, or the motion, but you can focus on giving a good speech and go back to all of your basic mechanics. Make sure that you're clear. Make sure that you're comparative. Make sure that you're doing all the basics of good debating, because that will always be useful in any round that you're in. Okay, lovely. That is actually then the end of my session. I hope that's really helpful. I do have 10 minutes left for questions. So does anyone have any questions that they wanted to ask? Okay, I see something in the chat. Okay, what kind of things should you focus on teaching at the start when you don't know the debaters? I think that the most essential thing is to develop a baseline. So you're not going to get a new debater to be excellent at everything, but you want to make sure that they're passably good at everything so they can actually enjoy debate. Because let's be honest, if you're standing up and you're incoherent when giving speeches and you feel demoralized, you're not going to enjoy debate and you're not going to want to continue. So a lot of this is about making sure that they have the basics to be able to construct a case, be able to develop arguments, make sure that they have the stylistic basics to feel confident enough in presenting, all that kind of stuff. I think that's fairly straightforward. So on top of that, what would I end up teaching afterwards? Honestly, one of the things that I've discovered in my own time debating is that debate philosophy is such a fundamental way in which we view debate. Whether or not we think we should evaluate debates with more intervention and scrutiny and using our common sense, so to say. Whether or not, for instance, we should think about intuition strongly. And for me, I spent the first 7 years of my debate career being like a flow-only North American-based debater and thinking about a different debate philosophy, how to employ realism and facts in order to properly leverage my strengths. That was a huge, huge thing that ended up improving my debating quite a lot. Okay, second question. Do you find the presence of a professional coach necessary? No, I don't think that a professional coach is necessary. A professional coach is always useful, but as long as you take and impart these lessons, you should be able to self-evaluate. So within a club, you should be able to find what the problems are. And what I would say is you should try and reach out and ask some debaters to see if they'll judge a spar. Most debaters are nicer than you think they are or are very bad at saying no. So in many circumstances, you can probably ask a debater to just judge one spar. They can give feedback, and hopefully you can use that feedback as a springboard for identifying general problems or general issues with your debating and trying to improve upon that. But absolutely not. I don't think a professional coach is necessary. I think that most clubs can do it themselves if they work on self-improvement. Tips for debaters who don't have great English skills. This is a great question. I'm not an ESL debater, so obviously I don't have the best guidance here. But I think for a lot of debaters who have poor English skills, you want to just think about the fact that debate is about logic and about facts and about strong argumentation. So don't get discouraged. ESL debaters can do fantastically in debate. I think discouragement is one of the first problems that ends up coming about. But on a secondary level, I think it's about realizing how you can win debates even without amazing English. There are lots of motions that just strictly don't require it. Like if you're in an econ or IR round, as long as you can communicate the ideas clearly, you don't need fantastic English, you just need something that is understandable. If it's a softer motion where it seems as if subjective preferences or style seems to seep into judging a little bit more, like say for instance, a social justice round, which I've heard a lot of speakers say can be somewhat biased in favor of EPL speakers. In that instance, you just want to think about ways to compensate for that. So again, all the tips I provided, thinking about ways to just have a shorthand or a list of words that you can use to sound powerful. And then also ensuring that you're able to still get seconds in these motions. And as long as you're analytically strong enough, you can still be able to beat most rooms, honestly speaking. It is very, very rare that that someone who has amazing analysis but not great English skills will lose to a team that's much worse than them or even a fair bit worse than them. So those are my tips. Unfortunately, I don't think that covers everything, but I hope that is helpful. How to draw the line between materials for training sessions and those for research assignments, considering a limited amount of time available. Typically, what I like to do is I like to gauge how much time my students have, because it's really going to depend on what they're doing and whether or not they have time in their own lives, whatever. So typically, if the students are really motivated, I like for them to do quite a bit of research first. And then with that research, we synthesize. Training sessions can then be used to talk about the material that has been looked at, using that material to develop more complex insights and then relating it to specific motions. If it's the case that they don't have very much time at all and you think they're not going to do very much work, I like to do a training session first, give them a general overview, and then give them a chance to use that general information to focus on their research and develop a case. And in the worst possible case, you might have to be quite interventionist or quite involved in case writing, but I find that's less pedagogically useful. Might be useful for that individual motion, not as useful for building general skills for that student in the long run. I hope that's helpful. Okay, great. Any further questions? Okay, with very large topics, IR philosophy, how do you approach smaller subtopics with your students? Well, what I personally do is I like writing out my matter sessions. So I usually type them all out and then I end up sending them over to my students so they have a chance to read it. And that is just useful because it gives them the time to process the material and figure out what issues they have and where we need to focus more particularly. So if I'm trying to just do a very, very broad overview, that's really useful for allowing the students themselves to narrow in on what matters to them and what they're curious about and what smaller subtopics you need to discuss. Now, in terms of dividing it before the fact, I oftentimes just try and find different kinds of divisions based on the type of philosophy or different regions. So for instance, if I'm talking about IR, I might think about Asia. And even within Asia, I might subdivide to East Asia, China, and relationships with Korea and Japan. If it's philosophy, honestly speaking, I kind of look at past reading lists from my university courses and I divide it up there. So justice, equality, utilitarianism. And honestly speaking, if you have some kind of academic background in whatever you're trying to teach, just look at the syllabuses or the syllabi and try and rip them off to a certain extent. Don't rip them off. But what I mean is use that as a way of generally organizing and dividing up your sessions. Because I mean, if they're doing it in universities and in academia and pedagogy, it's probably good enough to use in debate coaching as well. But yeah, I think generally make your own divisions, think about how things are connected, and then try and use natural divisions based on curriculum. How to start approaching large topics such as IR. So the first thing that I do with my students is I try and think about a general approach to IR. So how do we view IR debates? And I go through general theories of IR, liberalism, realism, constructivism, etc. I go over basics of things like colonialism and development, how that happened. I might go over general developmental economics. And then once I go over general principles and general theories, then I start subdividing into more specific areas. So I like to start with broader first principles. This is how you approach an IR debate. These are the different ideas in an IR debate. Always make sure that you're paying attention to a country's incentives and how those incentives come about. And then after I cover those broad things that allow people to have a background to understand everything, then I focus on more particular conflicts and I approach them with the kind of general information. So for instance, I might ask someone to use one of the broader general principles that we've discussed and apply it in China's relationships with Myanmar, for instance. I hope that's helpful as well. Okay, any further questions? Okay, seeing none, I think that pretty much takes us to the end of the session. Thank you everyone for coming today. I hope it was useful. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to send them over and the slides will be distributed soon.